Now, listen to me, because this story happened a long time ago. Back when the air in Atlanta, Georgia was thick, not just with humidity, but with rules. Rules forged from iron and pride. Rules that could shatter a family faster than any hurricane. The year was 1844. And if you found yourself on the wrong side of those rules, well, you were nothing. Our story begins in the very heart of that rigid world, on a massive estate called Oak Haven. Oak Haven was the jewel of the county, all white columns and manicured lawns, smelling faintly of jasmine and of the deep, rich soil that had swallowed so much human sweat. And ruling over Oak Haven, ruling it with a hand so firm it rarely trembled, was Mrs. Ellelanina Vance. Ellelanina Vance was not merely a lady. She was an institution. At 50 years old, she was sharp as a tack and carried herself as if the Queen of England had just stopped by for tea. Her gowns were forever perfect, her silver always polished, and her reputation was spotless within Atlanta society. Eleanor Vance was the very gold standard of Southern womanhood. She understood that in the South of 1844, a woman's power came not from land or money, but from her reputation. If that fell, everything fell with it. And Ellelanina lived in a state of constant, quiet terror that something, anything, might tarnish the Vance name. The source of her deepest anxiety, the thing that kept her awake when the cicadas sang their loudest, was her only child, her daughter, Clara. Clara Vance was 19 years old, and I tell you, she was a vision. Hair the color of dark honey, eyes that seemed to catch the light even in the dimmest room, and a restlessness that Ellelanina simply could not beat out of her. Clara was meant to be the perfect heiress, ready to marry a suitable, wealthy gentleman, secure the family line, and become the next Ellelanina Vance, a pillar of society. But Clara was not cut out for pillars. From around the time she turned 17, Ellelanina noticed the shift. It began subtly. Clara would be late for supper. Her gaze would drift during sermons, and she started to display a strange, almost defiant independence. She despised the endless rounds of teas and balls. She hated talking about crops and dowries. She seemed bored by the very air she breathed at Oak Haven. Clara, Ellelanina would say, tapping her fan sharply against her wrist. A lady does not wander the fields after sunset. People talk. Let them talk, Mama, Clara would reply, her voice low and husky, a sound that always grated on Ellelanina's nerves. Now, you have to understand the layout of Oak Haven to understand the danger. The main house was magnificent, surrounded by lush, formal gardens. But a good quarter-mile past the stables, hidden behind a thick stand of ancient oaks and weeping willows, were the quarters, the cluster of small, rough cabins where the enslaved people lived and worked. The line between the main house and the quarters was not merely physical. It was a chasm, enforced by law, custom, and violence. It was a line that, for a white Southern lady, was simply not to be crossed. Ever. But Ellelanina, driven by her maternal paranoia, began to notice things that suggested Clara was standing right on the edge of that chasm. It started with objects disappearing, small, insignificant things. First, a fine linen handkerchief embroidered with the Vance crest. Then, a few days later, a silver locket that Clara rarely wore. Eleanor dismissed it as carelessness. Then came the smells. One evening, Eleanor was checking Clara's room before the girl retired, a habit she maintained, claiming it was a mother's concern, but in truth, it was surveillance. She noticed a faint, smoky scent clinging to the heavy velvet curtains, something earthy and foreign, not the familiar lavender and expensive soap. It was the smell of the quarters, of wood smoke, cooking greens, and something vaguely metallic. Eleanor stood very still in the middle of the room. Her heart, usually so steady, began a frantic drumming against her ribs. She looked at Clara, who was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, her face turned away. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously smooth. "Have you been near the stables this evening?" Clara didn't flinch, but her reflection in the mirror seemed to freeze. "No, Mama. I was in the library reading." "The air is heavy in here tonight," Eleanor continued, walking slowly toward the window and pretending to adjust the drapery. "It smells unfamiliar." "Perhaps the wind changed direction, Mama," Clara replied, perhaps too quickly. "The smoke from the quarters drifts sometimes." Eleanor let it go. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. And in Eleanor Vance's mind, suspicion grew faster and stronger than any weed. She knew her daughter was lying. She just didn't yet know why. The next few weeks were a nightmare of silent observation for Eleanor. She began watching Clara like a hawk watches a field mouse. She noted the times Clara claimed to be napping, the long, silent hours she spent supposedly practicing the pianoforte, the way Clara's eyes would flicker toward the tree line when she thought no one was looking. Eleanor even started questioning the house servants, the maids who worked the main house, those few individuals allowed access to her private world. "Mabel," Eleanor commanded one afternoon, finding the small, nervous maid polishing a mahogany table in the drawing room. "Tell me everything you have seen Miss Clara doing in the past month. Do not omit a single detail. Your honesty will be rewarded. Your deception will be dealt with severely." Mabel, a woman terrified of the mistress, stammered out the usual routines. "Miss Clara reads, Miss Clara walks in the garden, Miss Clara is quiet." But then Mabel's eyes dropped to the floor. "Well, speak up, girl," Eleanor snapped. Mabel whispered, her voice barely audible. Sometimes Miss Clara asks me to leave her supper untouched on the small table outside the kitchen door. Says she will fetch it herself later, after everyone has gone to bed." Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin, white line. Why would Clara, who had a cook and a footman waiting on her every whim, insist on retrieving her own food late at night? And why would she ask Mabel to keep it a secret? It made no sense in the context of a respectable young lady. It made perfect sense, however, in the context of secrecy. Eleanor dismissed Mabel, her mind racing. This wasn't about a secret admirer from a respectable family. If it were, Clara would use notes and polite rendezvous in the parlor. This was something hidden, something shameful, something that required the cover of darkness and the complicity of the household staff. The pressure on Eleanor was immense. She had spent 2 decades building the Vance name, ensuring their place at the pinnacle of Atlanta society. If Clara was involved in anything that suggested immorality, or worse, impropriety concerning the rigid social structure, it would destroy them. It wasn't just scandal, it was ruin. In 1844, the purity of a young Southern woman was the linchpin of her family's entire social and economic standing. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She walked the halls of Oak Haven, a silent, gliding shadow, listening to the house breathe. She considered confronting Clara, demanding the truth. But Eleanor was too shrewd for that. A direct confrontation would only lead to denials and deeper concealment. She needed proof, irrefutable, damning proof. She decided she would conduct her own investigation. She would become the shadow watching her own daughter. The opportunity came 3 nights later. It was a Tuesday, a heavy, humid night with no moon, a perfect cover for secrets. Eleanor had feigned a severe headache, sending away her personal maid and locking her bedroom door early. She waited until the clock in the hall chimed 2 in the morning. The house was utterly silent, save for the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. Eleanor dressed quickly in a dark, simple gown, something she hadn't worn since before her marriage, and slipped soft leather slippers onto her feet. She moved with surprising agility for a woman of her standing. A lifetime of controlling her environment had taught her how to be silent. She crept down the main staircase, the wood groaning softly under her weight, a sound that made her freeze every few steps. She reached the first floor and made her way to Clara's room. The door was slightly ajar. Eleanor pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The bed was empty. The sheets were thrown back, cool to the touch, suggesting Clara had been gone for some time. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, heavy and metallic. She hadn't been wrong. Clara was out. But where? Eleanor moved through the house, checking the library, the parlor, the conservatory, all empty. She reached the back door, which led to the expansive veranda overlooking the fields. The latch was secure, but the bolt was not fully set. Someone had left in a hurry and been careless. Eleanor stepped out into the night air. The heat hit her immediately, muggy and oppressive. The scent of jasmine was strong, but underneath it, she smelled that faint, smoky, earthy odor again. And this time, she heard something else, a very faint sound carried on the breeze that sounded suspiciously like muffled laughter. The sound was coming from the direction of the quarters. A wave of absolute, blinding fury washed over Elenina. Her daughter, her perfect, highly-bred daughter, was out in the middle of the night, risking everything, her future, her family's name, her very life. And she was heading toward that place. Elenina didn't hesitate. Fear mixed with rage gave her strength. She lifted her skirts and began walking quickly, almost running, across the damp lawn toward the tree line. She had to be careful. If she was seen by anyone, a field hand returning late, a patrolling overseer, the scandal would start before she even knew the truth. She kept to the shadows, moving along the edge of the formal gardens until she reached the path that led through the oaks. The path was rough and overgrown, leading directly to the slave cabins. As she got closer, the sounds became clearer. It wasn't just laughter now. It was voices, low and conspiratorial, interspersed with the distinct sound of wood scraping against wood, perhaps a door or a bench. Elda's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. Every rule, every lesson of propriety she had ever lived by screamed at her to turn back, to ignore this horror and pretend it hadn't happened. But the fear of the unknown was worse than the fear of the truth. She had to know what Clara was doing. She reached the edge of the quarters complex. The cabins were dark, mostly silent. But one structure, set slightly apart from the others, an old, derelict storage shed near the edge of the woods, often used for curing tobacco, had a faint, flickering light visible through a crack in the wall. This was where the sounds were coming from. Elenina crept up to the shed, pressing herself against the rough wooden planks. The air here was thick with the smell of old smoke, dirt, and unwashed bodies. She moved agonizingly slowly until her eye was directly over the crack in the wood, just wide enough for her to peer inside. What Elena saw in that flickering lamplight was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for a clandestine meeting with a forbidden lover, perhaps a runaway, maybe even a dangerous gambler. But what she saw was far, far worse in the context of 1844 Atlanta. It was a scene that defied every law of nature and society as she knew it. Inside the small, dirt-floored shed, illuminated by a single smoky oil lamp, was Clara. Clara was not dressed in the silks and laces of the Vance household. She wore a simple, dark cotton dress, and her hair was tied back carelessly. She was sitting on an overturned barrel, leaning forward, her face animated and focused. And surrounding her, listening intently, were 5 enslaved men. They were all young, strong field hands, men Elenina recognized from the toughest work crews, men who were supposed to be asleep in their cabins, resting for the brutal dawn. Their names were Moses, Cato, Sam, Elias, and young Thomas. They were gathered around a makeshift table, and Clara was holding something in her hands, something small and white. Elenina couldn't hear the words clearly, only the low murmur of voices, but she could see the expressions on their faces. They weren't expressions of fear or servitude. They were expressions of intense concentration and something else, something akin to shared excitement. Then Clara shifted, and the light caught the object in her hands. Elelonina squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was a piece of slate, crudely cut, and the small white object was a piece of chalk. Clara was teaching them. She was drawing symbols on the slate, letters. She was teaching 5 enslaved men how to read and write. A cold, paralyzing shock ran through Elelonina. This wasn't just a breach of propriety. This was a criminal offense. Teaching slaves to read was strictly forbidden by Georgia law, seen as an act of rebellion and a direct threat to the entire structure of the plantation economy. If this were discovered, Clara would be arrested. The Key Vance name would be utterly ruined. And Elelonina herself might face severe penalties for negligence. But worse than the law, worse than the scandal, was the sheer intimacy of the scene. The easy way Clara sat among them, the way they leaned in, their heads close together, sharing a forbidden secret. It was a communion, a shared humanity that Elelonina had been taught her entire life was impossible and dangerous. Suddenly, one of the men, the tallest one, Moses, laughed, a clear, sharp sound that echoed in the silence of the night. He pointed to a letter Clara had drawn, and she smiled. A genuine, radiant smile that Elelonina hadn't seen on her daughter's face in years. That smile broke Elelonina. It was a smile of belonging, given to men who were property, not peers. The rage which had been simmering now boiled over, scalding her very soul. This was not merely disobedience. This was treason against her class, her race, and everything sacred about the South. Elelonina took a single step back, intending to retreat, plan, and then destroy this secret. But her foot caught on a loose root, and she stumbled, hitting the side of the shed hard with her elbow. The sound was loud, sharp. Inside the shed, the laughter stopped instantly. The flickering light went still. Elelonina froze, leaning heavily against the wall, her breath trapped in her throat. A moment of terrifying silence passed. Then Moses stood up slowly, his tall shadow stretching across the dirt floor. He looked directly at the crack where Elelonina stood, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute fear. "Someone is out there," he whispered urgently. Clara turned her head sharply toward the sound. She couldn't see anything, but she knew. She knew the sound of a heavy body stumbling, and she knew exactly who walked the grounds of Oak Haven late at night, searching for trouble. Clara's face went white. She knew, in that terrifying instant, that her mother had found her. And she knew what the consequences would be. Eleanor, realizing she had been heard, knew she couldn't run now. To run was to admit guilt and cowardice. She had to maintain control. She pushed off the wall, straightened her posture instantly, summoning all the rigid authority of Mrs. Elelonina Vance, Queen of Oak Haven. She raised her hand and slammed it against the flimsy wooden door of the shed, not once, but 3 times, with the sound of thunder. "Open this door." Immediately, Elelenina commanded, her voice cutting through the night like a whip. It was a voice that brooked no argument. A voice that promised utter devastation. "Clara Vance, open this door, or I shall have the overseer burn this structure to the ground with everyone inside." Inside, terror reigned. The 5 men scrambled, trying to hide the slate and chalk. Clara, however, knew resistance was useless. She stood up, her shoulders slumping in defeat, and slowly walked toward the door. She reached for the rough wooden handle, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open, revealing the horrific tableau to the mistress of Oak Haven. The smoky light spilled out, illuminating Elelenina standing there, backlit by the distant glow of the main house, a figure of terrifying, righteous fury. Elelenina didn't look at the men first. She looked directly at Clara, her daughter, standing there in the dim light, exposed and guilty. The betrayal in Elelenina's eyes was a physical force. "You," Elelenina hissed, the word barely a breath, yet it carried the weight of judgment and death. "You have ruined us all." The 5 men stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the ground, knowing that their lives had just been placed in the hands of the most unforgiving woman in the county. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic beating of Elelenina's heart. This discovery, the daughter, the slaves, the illegal education, was the bomb that would shatter the perfect facade of Oak Haven. Elelenina knew, standing there in the humid night, that merely punishing Clara in private would not be enough. The shame was too great. The risk to her reputation was too high. The punishment had to be public, absolute, and terrifying, or the Vance name would be utterly erased from Atlanta society. She took one last, long look at the 5 young men who had dared to learn, and at the daughter who had dared to teach. "Fetch the overseer, Silas," Elelenina commanded, turning her head slightly toward the darkness, her gaze still fixed on Clara. "Tell him to bring chains. And tell him to bring every soul from the quarters to the main yard. They will all witness what happens to those who forget their place." This was not just about punishment. It was about restoration. Elelenina Vance was about to prove, dramatically and brutally, that the rules of 1840 for Atlanta were unbreakable, even by her own blood. The night had just begun. Now listen to me, because when Elelenina Vance gave an order, the ground shook a little, even in the dead of night. She stood there, a dark figure of pure, solidified fury, and the air around her seemed to drop 20 degrees. Silas, the overseer, was a man used to violence, but even he moved with a nervous speed when the mistress called his name with that tone. He stumbled out of his small cabin near the stables, pulling on his rough coat, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. And then he heard the command again, sharper this time, carrying the full weight of Oak Haven authority. "Chains, Silas, and gather every soul." Silas knew instantly this was not a simple disciplinary matter. This was catastrophic. He grabbed the heavy keys and the thick iron shackles usually reserved for runaways or the most violent resistance. The clanking sound of that iron, even from a distance, was the sound of terror in the quarters. Back at the shed, the silence was absolute, heavier than the humid night air. Clara stood by the open door, refusing to meet her mother's gaze, but standing her ground. The 5 men, Moses, Cato, Sam, Elias, and Thomas, were huddled together, their faces slick with sweat and fear. All right. Thanks for the story. See you in the next video.